Welcome, everyone, to Cultivating Ideas for the 2024-2025 academic year. My name is Sean Watkins, and I serve as Associate Dean for Lifelong Learning. And Cultivating Ideas is one of the webinar series that we offer, both from our department and from Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. It is an opportunity for our best and brightest, our faculty, to dictate and demonstrate their research, their areas of interest and expertise, and things that they're just most passionate about. And when we think about cultivating ideas, I could not think of a better person to be able to kickstart this academic year for us than one of our favorite faculty, Dr. Bill Greenway. He is a professor of both philosophy and ethics on campus and is just beloved by our faculty, staff, and students. Dr. Greenway focuses on contemporary conversations among theology and philosophy and church and society. He's especially interested in theology and ecology and spirit and the spiritual life. He speaks regularly at churches, academic conferences, and publishes in journals like the Christian Century, the Journal of Religion, and Theology Today. He's the author of 4 books, and his lecture today is based on the final chapter of his book, In the Light of Agape, More Realism and Its Consequences. Sisters and brothers, welcome, Dr. Bill Greenway. Take it away, sir.
Thank you, Sean. I'll just get going. It's good to see some of you folks. I think I recognize every name, and it's really good to see you all. I hope you all are doing well. I'll just get right to it. I prepared something pretty much verbatim that's about 25 minutes, somewhere between 20 and 25 minutes, and we'll have ample time for conversation. So we'll just get going with that. Okay. John, you can see that okay?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Great, we'll go. The flowering of faith in the light of agape. In a world dominated by exploitative social Darwinian relations, we need global spiritual awakening and a move away from sectarian understandings of faith. Neither are possible if people think faith is irrational or that only one faith can be true. The philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas maps a path to rational and open spiritual awakening. Levinas, a Jew, was decisively awakened during 5 years' hard labor, captive in a Nazi camp. From the bowels of the Nazi horror, Levinas realized nothing is more sure than the moral reality of being taken hostage by the faces of those who are tortured and screaming out, "Do not hurt me, do not kill me." Inspired by Levinas, I talk about the same reality in terms of awakening to having been seized by agape for every face, including one's own. We see children squealing with delight in new fallen snow. We see the shocked faces of the survivors of the tsunami, broken bodies strewn about the background. We are not first objective, detached, neutral, and only then deciding what we think. No. Insofar as we are not by nature or through repeated hardening of heart psychopathic, whether they are scenes of joy or scenes of horror, we are instantly, before decision nor even reflection, joyful or horrified. The singular passion inflaming our joy or, in other circumstances, our horror, the palpable spiritual force over and against which we must exert ourselves if we decide to harden our hearts and react differently, that spiritual force is agape. Agape is the wellspring of good in a moral realist sense. So moral reality is not, to list modern candidates, a product of what is pleasurable, desired, preferred, biologically or socioculturally selected for, or implicitly or explicitly contracted. Moral reality is rooted in the real force signified by agape, a force as real as gravity, though different in kind. Initial defense of agape is best achieved as above through invocation of scenes which provoke joy or horror. For even peoples whose philosophies leave no place for realist affirmation of agape are profoundly awakened to it in their daily lives. Seized by agape, they are joyful when they see children squealing with delight in the snow, and horrified by the anguished faces of the survivors of the tsunami. Psychopaths, somehow cut off from agape, do exist, but they are no more an argument against the reality of agape than people who are colorblind are an argument against the difference between red and green. Agape is not irresistible. You can harden your heart. But this is a hardening of heart over and against a reality that manifestly is there. What I am unfolding here as existing, as really there, is a force as powerful, plain, and universal as the force we undergo and signify with gravity or curvature in space-time. This is a powerful argument for the existence of God insofar as God is love. For insofar as God is love, having been seized by agape for every face, including my own, is having been seized by God for every face, including my own. In this precise sense, God is as real as agape, as real as our joy over children laughing and playing in the snow, as real as our horror over children crying and screaming in the wake of the bombing. Secular scholars have reacted to my argument negatively because of a dogmatic commitment to metaphysical materialism. So they do not believe in God in any sense, and they do not want to believe in God in any sense. Some people of faith worry over my argument because this is not yet their particular God. For instance, agape is a real and intensely personal force, but it is not necessarily a person or triune. To be clear, God may be a person, God may be triune, but those claims lie beyond the scope of my argument for the reality of God, insofar as God is love. In a world in which intellectual elites are overwhelmingly secular, and faith is widely seen as irrational, an argument for the reality of the intensely personal moral force of agape, for God insofar as God is agape, is significant, especially if it can also provide a basis for communion among the world's faiths. But one might object, does not one understanding of God or one doctrine of atonement or incarnation, doesn't one have to be right and the others wrong? Perhaps. Or maybe divine reality so surpasses human understanding that no one way of thinking about God or doctrine is adequate. In any case, we should begin from what is most sure, and what is most sure is the reality of God insofar as God is agape. Doctrines do matter, but they matter because the point of doctrine is agape. Good doctrines of atonement are good insofar as they help us receive, understand, and live out agape. Bad doctrines are bad insofar as they cut us off from or lead to violation of agape. To riff on St. Augustine's ultimate test for doctrine, if it's not loving, it's wrong. This wholly reasonable affirmation of the reality of God correlates with a wholly reasonable understanding of faith, where faith does not signify believing despite a lack of evidence, where faith names a wholly reasonable and good existential response to agape, namely, faith is living out surrender to having been seized by agape for every face, including my own. That is, insofar as I do not harden my heart, insofar as I live surrender to having been seized by love for every face, including my own, I am faithful, faithful to God, faithful to agape. Remember that our experience of agape is searingly powerful when we face evils like the Holocaust. So, contrary to the modern idea that evil is an obstacle to faith, we are seized by agape with utmost power and conviction precisely when we face the most horrendous evils. Moreover, in surrender to agape, we are filled with urgent motivation to act. If I am seized in contexts of horror, I am horrified and immediately moved to resist. In contexts of joy, I am joyful and immediately moved to secure the joy. Since agape, like gravity, is a dimension of reality, it is universal. So, if there is life scattered across the cosmos, the reality of agape, like the reality of gravity, is manifest to higher life forms across the cosmos. In Christian vernacular, God is omnipresent. When I consider agape as a universal force, I also think about people who lived along what we call the Mississippi or the Amazon in the days of Isaiah and Micah, people who never heard of Judaism or Christianity. And I think about those who lived in those days along what we call the Yellow River or the Ganges, who never heard of Judaism, just as others across mountains and oceans never heard of Hinduism or Buddhism. When I think about isolated peoples across the earth, and remember that the reality signified by agape has always been as manifest as the reality signified by gravity, I realize that people from all times and places who did not harden their hearts would have undergone agape and developed ways to name, understand, and respond faithfully. So it is no accident that the profound but bare description of the undergoing of agape is in accord with the heart of Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, Islamic, and Jewish spirituality, and most every faith tradition on earth. No doubt, including spiritualities developed among ancient peoples who lived in what we now call the Americas. Obviously, all these traditions have not used the same words. Levinas uses hesed, Buddhists use maitri, Confucians use ren. But it is the reality we undergo, not the signifier which is essential. These different words testify to the same spiritual reality. And the emergence of different words and faith traditions among different peoples is no surprise. Again, agape signifies a force we primordially undergo, just as we primordially undergo the force we signify with natural motion or gravity or curvature in spacetime. Since we are thinking beings, we immediately think our undergoing of reality. And we immediately think our undergoing of agape in terms we receive, for we each emerge at specific points in history with diverse cultural linguistic ways of understanding. A 3rd century Hindu woman in what we now call India, a 9th century Islamic man in what we now call Saudi Arabia, an 18th century indigenous person in what we now call Argentina. Which means we all grow up thinking our primordial undergoing of reality, and we signify and theorize one dimension of our undergoing in terms of natural motion, gravity, or curvature in spacetime, and we signify and theorize another dimension of our undergoing of reality in terms of agape, hesed, maitri, or ren. Because we all find ourselves thrown into one historical and geographic particularity or another, we will invariably identify as faithful people in terms of a particular community of faith, as Buddhist, Confucian, Haudenosaunee, Jew, Muslim, Sioux, Wiccan. That is simply reality. And it need not be a problem as long as being faithful to agape within our own community is also about being for what is loving, good, and just for other communities, insofar as they too are faithful to agape. Naming the undergoing of having been seized by agape isolates the primordial reality at the heart of the great systems of understanding that are Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, Zen, and all the rest. To be sure, all these traditions have carried harmful systemic distortions and have been misappropriated to evil ends. But those misappropriations are not consistent with the central texts or teachings or with the character of the saints revered by the world's major faith traditions. for those misappropriations are not in accord with our undergoing of agape. This is why no major faith tradition celebrates people who are brutal, selfish, exploitative, or destructive. To the contrary, there is massive ethical consensus among all the world's historic faiths about ethical issues which affect literally tens of billions of people and other creatures. The idea of an inevitable sectarianism among the world's religions, let alone secular elites' frequent depiction of religions as, above all, irrational, even selfish sources of worldly horrors, is neither innocent nor true. For the idea that the world's faiths are fundamentally opposed masks their shared witness to agape and cuts us off from massive consensus about condemning greed and selfishness, massive consensus about the call to feed the poor, heal the sick, clothe the naked, visit and defend the persecuted, to work to ensure maximal flourishing and happiness for all creatures, humans, cats, cockroaches, maple saplings, all despite living in a world which we will never make perfect. Global interfaith ethical consensus over such significant matters is so overwhelming that if it were made manifest, say explicitly celebrated in an entry hall of the United Nations or as a chapter in standard world history textbooks, it might help to fuel political momentum for addressing some of the world's most pressing needs. Unfortunately, the idea that the world's faiths are irrational is so powerful among global elites that a tour of the United Nations headquarters in New York suggests the world doesn't have any faith traditions. And the idea that the world's faiths are wholesale, at odds with one another, is so widespread, even among people of faith, that the threat of sectarianism looms immediately when I name diverse faiths, as if folks like Isaiah, Siddhartha, Jesus, the Prophet Muhammad, Black Elk, as if they were all to get together, they would want to fight one another. What do we imagine these folks, if they were transported together in today's world, would say to us about this world, about what is needy, what is important, about the vast inequities of wealth and power, about what our goals and actions and policies should be? In order to dissipate sectarian tendencies, it is helpful to think of diverse religions in an aesthetic modality. Think of diverse faiths and doctrines the way you think of renowned works of art. We enjoy all sorts of renowned symphonies and songs and paintings and sculptures, and we celebrate the creation of new and different great works of art because of the way in which they enhance our lives. In a similar fashion, we can appreciate the many different ways of organizing community and of affirming life and naming and living in fidelity to agape that we find within and among the world's great faith traditions. We can think of them as great communal poems written in an attempt to give faithful, complex contour to our understanding of and to open us to agape. While there are glorious differences in the way various faiths interpret agape and order loving lives, diverse faiths agree about the essence of faith being surrender to agape. So this celebration of diversity does not enable ethical relativism. I think this point can be affirmed from within all the great faith traditions, but I will only speak in relation to my own Christian tradition and suggest that when in 1 John 4, when 1 John 4 says, if you do not love each other, you do not know God, for God is love, or when Jesus in the parable of the sheep and the goat says, if you see someone in need and you do not help them, you have forgotten God, they speak as one with faith traditions across the globe. There are many areas of ethical disagreement within and among faith traditions, but that should not distract us from an amazing range of consensus which, if acknowledged, this bears repeating, could have profound implications for social programs and political policies of vital significance for billions. In sum, not only are there no wholesale differences among the world's faith traditions, but much of the diversity among the world's faiths should be celebrated because it multiplies ways of living in loving and just community. The same holds for diversity within religious traditions. just as the reality and potential of agape is richer insofar as it is faithfully expressed in Buddhist, Hindu, humanist, Islamic, Jewish, Navajo, Wiccan, and other varieties, so say Christianity is richer because it is expressed in an array of Baptist, Catholic, Episcopal, Mennonite, Methodist, Orthodox, Presbyterian, Quaker, and other varieties. Again, there is no space here for ethical relativism. Because the source is agape, there can be no celebration of diversity at any point where any tradition violates agape. At that particular point, a tradition is wrong, and in fidelity to agape, we must condemn and struggle against that particular aspect of that tradition. Obviously, there are enduring ethical disagreements among reasonable and good people, both within and among religious traditions. But again, areas of disagreement over quandary issues should not lead to wholesale condemnation of any tradition, nor detract from the significance of the massive overlapping ethical consensus among faiths over what is clearly right to do in the light of agape. For instance, regarding basic truths about what is loving in relation to food, shelter, education, healthcare, or autonomy, and in response to exploitation, abuse, poverty, and neglect, just for starters. I drew a picture to represent my vision of the relation among agape and the world's faiths. I call this the flower of faith blooming in the light of agape. At the center of the flower is the fundamental event of having been seized by the reality of agape. There is no conceptual content, no beliefs, just the raw, blazing reality, the undergoing which, after the fact, we name and describe in terms of agape, Hesed, Maitri, Ren. Flowing out from the center, the raw undergoing from which they all blossom, are the petals of the flower, each a different color. Each petal represents a different faith tradition. Here I would include even relatively young traditions like humanism. We should include every tradition with agape at its heart. Again, each petal represents a different faith tradition, each is a different color, and then within each petal there are different hues of color, cobalt, sky, and navy hues of blue, which represent different streams of understanding within each faith tradition. For instance, within the multi-hued petal of Christianity, and overlapping at many points, especially near the center, there would be Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant hues. And within the Protestant, there would be Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodist, Wesleyan, Arminian, all hues within the petal of Christianity. Each of these hues increasingly overlaps with one another nearer the center of the flower, which signifies the primordial event of having been seized by agape. Likewise with other petals of faith. That is, likewise with Buddhism, humanism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, Latter-day Saints, and Wiccan. All the petals, with all their hues, that is, all the world's historic faiths and all their diversity, are rooted in the same undergoing. All are flowering from and are the flowering of agape. So, let us enjoy full confidence in the reality of agape and the reasonableness of faith. Let us live surrender to having been seized by agape for every face of every kind, including our own. Let us take joy in being blessed and in blessing others. Let us celebrate diverse and faithful ways of embodying agape in our daily lives. Let us live together as salt of the earth.
Thank you, Dr. Greenway. My goodness, what a profound lecture. Thank you, truly. My goodness. All right. Let me let some additional folks in here. And absolutely. All right. Well, Dr. Greenway has concluded his lecture, and I want to invite folks who have questions about Dr. Greenway's lecture and his topic overall. Why don't you go ahead and drop those in the chat? Love to be able to hear from some folks. We've got about half an hour for a Q&A discussion, and we'd love to hear back from you. It's Dr. Greenway. To kind of kick us off, as folks are thinking through some of their questions in light of your very profound lecture, uh, we've been having conversations, at least in the Department of Lifelong Learning, around issues of faith and justice, diversity, politics, in particular last night with our event in politics and faith. And I love your lecture too, and the realities that agape really is truly available for all, but definitely can be lacking in a tremendous amount of ways and places, especially around understanding different religious groups or even just the diversity of opinions and backgrounds that can be present. Whenever there's conflict there at heightened levels, there's a lack of agape. And so I'd love to hear from you just for a moment again, as folks are generating those questions. What are some places in which, as you've looked at what's happening in American society today, that you instinctively or reflexively can point to and say there's a lack of agape there? I wish that Christians, especially, even the people of God, would have more of an approach, have more of an agape type approach, and that could potentially eliminate some of the discord, miscommunication, and chaos that's erupting. In other words, as you look at the grand scheme of things that's happening in our country, we're very polarized and divided right now. What comes to your mind around those areas? And if you could articulate, yeah, agape needs to be present here. I think if agape was present in deeper and more meaningful ways, as a consequence, yeah, we would see a lot more shalom and a lot more justice.
Um, well, of course, you could point to so many obvious things. So I don't know where to start listing without, inevitably leaving out. So the I think what I'm looking to do with this move is to change a fundamental approach to thinking about the diversity among people of different faiths, where faith is construed broadly, so that there's an emphasis on what I think is a vast commonality and consensus about what's loving and good, which remains unnamed. And that then if we would focus on that is what we hold in common and work from what is most clear in relation to that, and then engage our differences on top of that, that would help to prevent some of the more, I mean, obviously sectarian and violent sorts of conflicts and clashes. So right now, I think we actually are very sectarian in multiple facets. And so that allows us to make others really other, not in a good sense, but in a radically other sense. And we tend towards caricature, and it can fuel, even you see someone not as a, in Christian terms, child of God, but as someone who's evil. And I think that is that dynamic and the failure to name what's common. So I've been a part of communities which are all about their differences, and they're focused on, we're this group, that group, and the other group. And I've also been in part of communities that are similar, that have the exact same differences, but their lead foot's been on their commonality. And
Mm,
then out of that commonality, they debate the differences.
yeah.
And I guess what I'm doing with this is and this is part of all my books. I didn't go to the final slide where I do they're up to six now, six books. This is the sixth one. But all of them are part of this single argument, trying to argue for the reality of agape. The way I
Mm,
say it in my ethics class is, in a typical ethics course in a university, a standard thing is to go through one modern ethical theory after another, use them to address one quandary issue after another, and then you come out with the conclusion that all ethics is relative because they all fail. They all have failures. And
mm,
so you can have very reasonable, intelligent students. I mean, this is pretty standard in universities. In fact, many so-called ethics courses in universities aren't doing actually ethics. They're doing whatever the guild is, or compliance, or, this is the legal realm, this is business ethics. This means this is what the law says you have to do. It's not ethics, it's legality or
mm,
compliance or something like
mhm,
that. That's the degree to which ethics is elided in modern rationality. So you have courses like this, students come out of the course, and really reasonable, intelligent students have this idea that all ethics is relative, right? Which is not innocent, especially if, in fact, as I'm arguing, there is massive global interfaith consensus about a host of issues, which if we just acted on those, I'm not talking about the things where there's all this debate. I'm talking about these fundamental things that make a difference in people's lives where there's all this consensus. If we just changed policies in relationship to those, it could make a massive difference in people's lives. But the idea that all ethics is relative allows people who actually benefit from this idea there's not this common consensus. So when you have these sorts of issues, it's not a sense as, well, maybe there are realistic limits to what we can do because there's actual political and other obstacles, but we all know this would be the ideal. So let's now have the discussion out of that context. No, that's not how it goes. You just have debates from different positions with the idea it's all relative. So the idea that all ethics is relative actually empowers those who are benefiting from exploitation of others related to violations which are related to fundamental goods. And this could be unpacked in terms of basic access to food, education, just basic safety, healthcare, all these sorts of issues globally. And what's ironic is at the very same time as you have this happening, and so it's not innocent and it's not an accident that it's so prominent in modern Western universities, which are, of course, very much a part of this elite system benefiting from the idea that all ethics is relative, right? At the very same time, you'll have people, and I could, if you bring up pedophilia or white supremacy or a host of other things, then they become absolutists, right? They're not ethical relativists at
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
about a
Yeah.
whole host of issues. And so it doesn't make any sense because on the one hand, they're ethical relativists. On the other hand, they're complete absolutists, but in a way which is not informed by agape. And so then that becomes, instead of a loving approach, which is then, open in diverse ways to addressing these things with some grace as well, that then becomes sectarianism of another sort. And can view, even though the ethic is right. So what I see out there is massive conceptual confusion related to the Western systemic eliding of ethical realism, moral realism. That's what I'm talking about in the very beginning. When I say there's all these surrogates for ethics that modern candidates, none of them are ethical. And no one thinks they've all succeeded. So we have on the one hand, what we have on what I've painted that in general is a massive systemic confusion, which then exacerbates the tensions you're talking about. Yeah. Instead of working from common ground. And in particular, I'm saying here, and I was stunned. I went and toured the United Nations headquarters. It was stunning. It really, you could tour that whole thing. If you were from another planet and toured it, you wouldn't know Earth had faith traditions. What are the odds of the United Nations realizing its goals, which I think are wonderful goals, without being able to integrate people of faith across the globe? I mean, we're talking about billions of committed people, and you're going to somehow realize these ends while ignoring them all and not connecting with them. At the same time, I mean, the UN does tend to work at consensus levels. Almost all of the goals, and that's where I include humanism, are these humanist goals which actually are common, they're fueled themselves by agape in a way they can't justify, right? So they'll go to happiness, or they're just stuck. They have no ethical basis for the ethical things they're doing. And because of that, they can't see the ethical commonality with all the world's faith traditions, which would be a massive resource for them to utilize, right? So this is what's happened in modernity. We have this vision of these siloed holes, all these differences, and this vision is itself a systemic distortion in ideology, which protects folks who are benefiting from clear and obvious exploitation of others. And that's what I want to, that's the meta goal, or the underlying goal between this attempt, which that goes to your question kind of without isolating particular things. If I accepted that invitation, I'd be kind of accepting an invitation to the sort of sectarianism I'm trying to resist, because then we tend to caricature and do that sort of a thing. So, yeah.
That's
So I guess that's the
wonderful.
best answer I have to your question.
That's absolutely wonderful. Spoken like a true philosopher and an ethicist. I appreciate, I always try to do softballs to all of our professors as we're getting ready to hear from our audience. And so I appreciate you taking the question and zooming back out to 50,000 feet and saying, let's begin with people, let's begin with need, and let that be the foundation for our ethics. A stunning critique, I think, of the Guild, of the Academy, of our education system, of politics, and even in government as well, too. It reminds me of Mortimer J. Adler's How to Read a Book from 1946. And he talked about how we have so many books that are beginning to come out around character and around ethics, but they all are performative, and we've lost some of the foundational issues that precisely what you're bringing up. So thank you so much. Just a helpful reflection. Just to kick us off, again, just as a reminder for folks, if you've got questions for Dr. Greenway, we want to make sure you put those in the chat. If you are feeling confident and want to ask that question verbally yourself, I'm going to ask you to both come off of mute and also to turn your cameras on as well too. We're recording, and we want to make sure that we have that recorded for our archives. Dr. Greenway, we do have one question that's come in, and I want to read it to you, and would love to get your thoughts and reflections on it. It says, are you proposing agape as a transpersonal force? That is, Buddhists speak of a transpersonal force of light and life. And how do we make connection between agape being transpersonal and Christianity's emphasis on a personal God?
Yeah. And the answer is, of course, yes. Although I'm not saying agape is a transpersonal force, and so there is no personal God, right? That would be too strong a conclusion as well. A conclusion I don't think Buddhists are philosophically entitled to, and not one all Buddhists would have. I mean, there's varieties of Buddhism where there is something like a personal God. What I'm saying is let's look at the commonality, right? Because, let's not get lost in the debate. And that's what I was trying to say. Is God personal or not? Well, maybe one or the other, or, I mean, let's be honest, with every religious tradition which talks about how our ways of knowing are so limited that they can't encapsulate the divine. So we kind of say that with one sentence and then say, but God's triune and has these properties, right? We've got to be serious about that and say, well, maybe the divine is such that it transcends this personal, impersonal divide even. I don't know. Maybe not. What I'm saying is do you need to know the answer to that question to have any to have any more surety about the reality you're primordially undergoing of agape, which is, and so, light and life. I find those to be vague terms, right? I think Buddhists would, and of course, Buddhists they have all sorts of categories. They fill this out, right, in all sorts of ways. And so I think when you think of Siddhartha's four sights, it's not that he just saw these four things, and he didn't just see these four things and get worried about himself. He saw these four things in the light of agape, is how I would read that, right? He sees the person dying, he sees the person starving, the disease. He is moved and opened up to agape. What I'm saying is this is a reality, and this is where the parallel to gravity comes in. So in my technical arguments, I use Richard Rorty to make a post-representationalist argument so that we don't begin to think of which gets us beyond the metaphysical naturalism, which makes you think, well, when we talk about gravity, we're signifying a reality that's really there. But when we talk about agape, we're signifying a reality which is a sociocultural construction or something like that. That just makes no sense. There's no reason to think that. There's no argument for that, right? And so what you observe is, wait a second, the Buddhists, the Confucians, all of them, it turns out, these classic traditions, excepting some modern ones, like the lifeboat ethics of Garrett Hardin, president of the Western Society of Social Sciences, publisher of a famous article on the tragedy of the commons, right? His lifeboat ethics was, once the boat's full, you can't let everyone else in or everyone drowns. So, the better thing to do is to protect the boat. And he says, the boat's full. We can't sustain everyone on Earth. So what we should do is find those most advanced societies and help them survive through the great die-off, right? So that's a modern ethic, which is absolutely not ethical. There's no agape there, right? So, but aside from those sorts of things, which ironically happen, those social Darwinian ethics, which happen in the context of a background Darwinian metaphysic, there's no accident here, right? Although most Darwinians hate social Darwinism, and rightly so. So I'm not against Darwinism as a biological theory, but when you turn it into a metaphysic, then you've got a different issue, a different problem. So yeah, what I'm saying here is, yeah, it's the same fundamental reality. We can isolate it. And then I want to say, there might be ways in which thinking of God is, and it could be also arguments would go where we develop in different ways. But also as we unpack that, there might be ways in which we who are, Christian can read Buddhist texts and learn about other interesting ways to think about this love, which we've not thought of. And there maybe are ways in which Buddhists can read Christian texts and have the same thing. But what I don't want to do, which has been the modern move, which this might look similar to, is a move to a lowest common denominator, right? That's what I'm not doing. So this is where I'm not doing either, for those of you who know, either the Yale School of the cultural linguistic model or the Chicago School, right? Right? I'm kind of doing them both. So I'm saying that, and it's the same with science, right? So whether you're doing gravity and you're with Aristotle or Newton or Einstein or some string theorist, the reality is there. Einstein and Newton Einstein, Aristotle, and Newton, all sitting under an apple tree, knew to look out for apples falling on their heads, right? So the diversity of the theory doesn't move from the kind of basic truth that they share in common. So that would be the same thing here. What you don't find is a basic difference between the Buddhist understanding of that force, right? Which I think that if you unpacked it in Buddhist terms, you'd get something very much like being seized for every face, right? Just as I'm seeing here in Christianity and in Judaism, in other words, right? So that's what I'm saying. This is a phenomenology of religious experience. But then, of course, we unpack it, right, out of our throne situations in all these different ways. And what I want to say then is as long as we don't violate what is most clearly agapic in that fundamental way about which there's massive consensus, then we should see all that diversity not as oppositional, right, but as creative possibilities, different ways of living out agape. And then at these levels, we don't have to say, well, it's either your or my doctrine of God as personal or impersonal. I mean, exactly how sure can we be about that, right? I mean, the claims there are immense. I can't be nearly as sure about that as about the fundamental source of agape, right? This or that theory of atonement, who knows? God's triune. Are you going to really assert this? This has got to be, I know this? How, right? So there is a benefit to thinking. I mean, when I unpack God as triune, it's a meaningful thing to unpack, but because of the ways in which it helps us to live out, unfold, and make manifest agape. Again, that's the test of the doctrine. So the point is not to get the doctrine for the sake of having the right doctrine. The point of the doctrine is agape. And when you read, these texts, you find across these traditions, that's what they're all gesturing to. One other thing I made a point here that might not have been as clear is that, especially because the title of my book is wrong. I love Westminster John Knox. I appreciate them, and they did it for sales and legal reasons. But it shouldn't be a reasonable belief. It should be a reasonable faith. Because belief is about an affirmation of some proposition, right? I believe God, this, that, or the other. Faith is not about any content. Faith is an existential surrender to the reality of agape. And then you have beliefs about agape. But once you get into those beliefs, well, now you're within the thrownness of your contingency and your tradition, right? So if any of us, it's hard to know what this means, but if any of us were the same person, but born in the 4th century in Tibet or in the 5th century in China, you would be thinking in those terms. It turns out you happen, probably most people here, to have been born in the 20th century or 21st century, depressingly enough, and within these terms. So you're thinking in these terms. That's just contingency in history. And there's nothing wrong with that, because even with that, we can get to this essence of agape, which we can affirm and have confidence in. But then the further we develop out, right, the more particular my doctrines get, right, of the various things, the less sure I can be of them in terms of them being absolute, but also in terms of them being faithful to agape as they enhance, the more I can, because I'm not making these claims that are now over and against others, right? It's, again, think aesthetic. Now I can just take joy that we have this wonderfully developed way of thinking with all this complexity about these doctrines, or about, the tenfold path, or however you do it in the different religious systems, right? And in each of those, the only judge is its fidelity to agape. And then, so I can affirm that Jesus is incarnate and God is triune without making a claim, because of the way I understand the nature of that affirmation, its connection to agape. That doesn't mean a Buddhist who's saying something else is not living in faithful connection to God. That doesn't mean, as Wesley loved to say, that doesn't mean Isaiah and Abraham were not in faithful connection with God, because they didn't think of God as triune, right?
Mm.
So that's what I'm trying to do and work out. Let me keep going to the other.
Love that. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Green. We've got time for about one more question. It comes from Bryson. He says, seeing that the system continues to both divide faith traditions and convince those traditions that we are more different than alike, how can pastors equip people to help in toppling the system? Do we preach agape through Christ as what we've been doing, or do we need a more intentional in naming this reality and point to other traditions?
Yeah, well, um, so, I mean, I think everyone might have different ways in which they're called to respond to this and to work with it. So I guess the first thing to say is, it seems like the impulse to sectarianism, right, to try to think in terms of my community over and against every other community is incredibly powerful. And especially, what we see historically is you could get this dynamic with communities that are historically oppressed. I mean, I'd use Schleiermacher for this. So Schleiermacher in early is before the German nation, right? The principalities. Schleiermacher's church, his home, his town is overrun by Napoleon. He sees all this brutality. The German state is completely weakened, and so he has all this stuff that's about, he helps found modern Germany. He gets the university system going. He writes all this stuff, which in context is about giving a sense of identity and pride to these people who are scattered and diverse. But a century later, when Barth's reading him, and one of his confirmands named Bismarck has had an influence, 60 years later, and now we're looking at World War I and Wilhelm the First and this German imperialism. The very things that Schleiermacher said when the Germans were scattered to help give them identity and a sense of being valuable have become the very thing which now are have now turned, and they've now moved from oppressed to oppressors. In contemporary times, I would say look at Ortega, right, who went from being, great liberating force to now essentially a dictator, or what's his name in Mozambique, Mugabe, right? Again, very much a liberator. All that has become the opposite. So there's just what I'm saying here is uh, what I do as a philosopher and theologian and ethicist. I look at these big systemic distortions and say, what's going on here at this really deep level, which maybe we can address, which over the next, if we can get this going, right? And I'm actually feeling a lot of momentum. There's a lot of secular scholars who want somehow to get back to moral realism and can't. So I think this is going to turn. I don't know how or with whom, and these are at this level, Descartes' ideas take a century. Schleiermacher's problems take a century, right? But the thing is, they make a difference when you give these fundamentally different ways of viewing the world. In the long run, they make a big difference in how people frame the very issues they're going at, right? In the meantime, there's also folks working in communities where these other dynamics are incredibly strong. And so, I don't know, I don't think there's a short way out of this, right? And so I guess one thing I would say is, lessen your expectations, be patient with yourself, be realistic what people can do. Try to always remain faithful to agape. So maybe always try never to caricature, never to stereotype, always to, see, make love your enemy not just a cute phrase, but the way in which you remain in agape with your enemy. When I unfold this in my books in terms of Levinas, and I do this also more recently when I talk about moral injury, that's what moral injury is. Your enemy is your enemy. You're in a context where you're caught, like Levinas was as a soldier in the French army, where you're actually shooting and killing other people. But that's wrong. It's morally wrong. It's a violation of agape, even though it's ethically right, given your options in real time, right? So make sure those tensions are always felt. The enemy is never, someone you just hate. Now, frankly, in the very moment, I don't know if that's psychologically possible, but in the long run, it's clear it's essential because moral injury happens when people have done the right thing and killed others, but people are not helping them deal with the violation of agape they have experienced. And right now, all the literature trying to address moral injury, the dominant Brits, a guy named Letts is one of the lead people. He still has to say it's related to something the person did wrong because he doesn't have any space for something that can be, the modern thought has no space for something that can be simultaneously right ethically and wrong morally because they have no moral. You do your calculation, you figure out and that's just right, period. That the modern thought is so weak and narrow and simplistic compared to the great religious traditions, right? Which were formed largely by people who had actually killed other people and were struggling with that. I mean, the depth of those reflections. Paul's a killer. And if you read him, he, and he won't even talk about, we hear from others what happened, in Acts. Paul, just like he won't even talk about his own conversion experience. The guy's not shy to talk. But when you get to these places, he's curiously, it's so sacred, but so much more. So you got to read between the lines and get this back. So anyway, so this, I think this has the potential to be part of an intellectual movement, which could be very powerful in these regards and form in decisive ways our thought. It moves decisively. So it's in some ways similar to Schleiermacher, similar to Feuerbach, similar to Hick, but it's also decisively different. And also it's scientific. And it's called, the subtitle and everything is Moral Realism Theory. I'm actually trying to get with social scientists. I can't get people to work with me on this, and I don't have the knowledge to do social scientific stuff, but I think this should be testable. That we should be able to discern this reality, and moral injury would be my, lead case, right? Where the inability to name what's moral. It's funny, they came up with moral. They didn't want moral. They just had no other word that fit what the soldiers were forcing them to say, but they still have no definition for it. So that's my little piece, is to work there, right? What Sean called 50,000 feet. And a lot of people think 50,000 feet doesn't matter.
It does.
It does, because you fall from 50,000 feet because you got the wings wrong. And a lot of where we are, it's because of what happened in the Enlightenment and systemic distortions of the Enlightenment. And over time, they've worked their wheel and they make a difference in how we frame issues. So we can't even name, let me use one concrete example, COVID vaccinations, right? Global pandemic, potentially killing millions of people, right? Should the US have allowed other countries to make the vaccine and issued patent waivers? Or should the US have told those other countries, if you make the vaccines and violate the patent waivers, we will boycott you and punish you financially and destroy your economic systems, right? Every religious tradition in the world would say, in that context with that threat, and by the way, if you're actually doing vaccines to address public health, you make sure everyone gets it so nothing can develop somewhere else. I mean, that's where the double talk of the pharmaceutical industry on this, everyone in the States had to do it as a moral imperative, but nowhere else are we going to have it done as a moral imperative, right? This is, and there's the Catholic archbishop in South Africa called it vaccine apartheid. Which it was. So here's one thing. I mean, I don't want these companies not to make money. They can make profits, but they were making plenty of money. But the U.S. government, Trump and Biden, both told these other governments that if they made the vaccine, they would destroy their economies. And that stopped the vaccine from being made. There is no question on the basis of any ethical or religious system what the answer to that question should have been, and we did the opposite. That's what I mean about these are systemic distortions which allow really bright folks on the one hand to think all ethics is relative, on the other hand to just be emotivist and sectarian about certain ethical issues, where I would probably agree with them. but not with the way they do it, right? And not with their inability to justify it. It just becomes, at that point, it becomes sectarian in the worst possible sense. So that's where I see us in deep trouble because of philosophical problems. But I'm working at 50,000 feet. We also need people working at 10 feet, right?
Yeah.
Or 1 foot away. And so as a pastor, you might be there, and that means you have to adapt to your context and maybe only make very small steps forward, but you meet your people where they are in a loving way, right? The point's not to be deceptive, but the other thing is not just to get them to say whatever we think is right if it's a mile ahead of them, right? Meet them where they are. But on the other hand, unfolding this love, opening up in these ways can make a difference, right? If bad theology hurts the people who hold it, right? They think that this is happening to them because they've done something wrong and God hates them, right? That's horrible theology.
Yeah.
But but that's why I want us to keep track. Let me I
We are
guess you said
actually
it,
at
we're at
time.
time, and I actually have a class that starts in 2 minutes.
You do.
Let me just say,
So
because I see a lot of names here, and I think I know them. I do know them all, and so I'm always willing to talk to any of you any other time. I'm going to make a YouTube video of this, and if you see anything that you think I should change, it hits you. I saw a couple of errors as I did it, but anything else content-wise, it's a little repetitive, but I actually did that deliberately to try and get the points to sink in. But if you have suggestions for me, if you would email this to me, I would really appreciate it. And if you ever want me to talk or do something like this in other contexts for you all, with Zoom, we can do that anytime, anywhere nowadays. So consider me open. So with that, thank you,
wonderful.
Sean. I'll let you
Thank
close us
you.
out.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Greenway. Immensely just a wonderful presentation and a visceral reminder of the necessity of having a proper ethic and philosophical foundation before we attempt to lead and pastor and engage in very complex and intricate issues. Thank you immensely, again, Dr. Greenway, for kicking us out for Cultivating Ideas. Join us next week on October 3rd. We'll hear from Reverend Dr. Jen Lord, a professor of homiletics and liturgical studies. She'll expound on making the most of the font part 2 of baptismal spirituality as her follow-up to a webinar in our last series. In this webinar, we'll look at the act of baptism, its rites and theologies in order to consider how the church is a community of the baptized and what a baptismal spirituality looks like in our storm-tossed world. So we will see you on October 3rd, same time, same Zoom link. Blessings, everyone. Enjoy your day and your week. Take care. Bye-bye.